everyone, Rose here, and it's time for some Retopology and Rigging. Since you guys seem to enjoy last week's more talky video, in this video I'll be talking about my thought process when it comes to Retopology and Rigging. I am by no means an expert on these things, especially not rigging, but I've picked up a couple of things over the past 4 years of making 3D models, and from just talking to people who do it a bit more professionally, or looking at YouTube videos or models on ArtStation. So I hope you guys can get something out of it, and with that being said, on to the time-lapse. Starting with Retopology, for the entire Retopology process I'm sort of trying to balance 3 things about my model. I want to maintain the detail from my high poly sculpt, I want to make the model low poly enough so that it can run properly in whatever it's going to be used for, and I want the model to deform nicely when it's rigged and animated. Depending on what the model is for, or what kind of model it even is, those things can be very different. For example, if you have an asset like a rock or a house, it doesn't really need to deform. Or if you have something that's, say, going to be used for just animation or 3D printing, it's not going to need to be as low poly, because it doesn't need to be able to render in real time, but it has to be able to subdivide fairly well, and you might also need to use something like a displacement map on it, so the model itself needs to be built in a way that it supports a displacement map well. That being said, in this case I'm working on a character model that's supposed to be real-time friendly. The commissioner wants to be able to use it for stuff like VR chat or games. That means I have to work with a relatively low poly count. Specifically, I'm trying to stay under around about 30,000 triangles or 15,000 quads, because that's just the recommendation VR chat gives for their avatars to work very well. That would make it a bit difficult to get all the details from the sculpt to show up in the final model, but luckily I can use a normal map to bake in all the surface details, so I don't have to worry about those at this point. Tune in next week for more about normal maps. So for this particular model, I didn't really have much trouble staying within my poly count while also maintaining all the details I needed to maintain from the sculpt, so I could focus most of my attention on just making sure the topology flowed properly and I could get good deformation later out of it. Hopefully, at least. And for one, that's because I could use a normal map, but also because it's a relatively simple stylized character who doesn't have like clothes or hair that would really drag up my poly count quite a lot. And because I was already planning for the type of topology he needed while I was working on the sculpt itself. And that's actually quite important. So here's a couple of things that you can keep in mind while sculpting that will make your life a lot easier when you have to go to Retopology. The most important thing I've found is keep the silhouette relatively simple. Don't have a whole bunch of small details that stick out really far from the model, because retopologizing those is an absolute nightmare. You can have a whole bunch of small details like tufts of fur like I have on this model, or even scales, or the implication of feathers and stuff like that, as long as they're really flush to the surface, because that way you don't have to worry about them at all while retopologizing. You can just retopologize over them as if they weren't there, but the final model will still look like it has all those details right in the geometry because they can be picked up really well by a normal map. Or for a higher poly kind of film style model, they can be picked up well by a displacement map too, probably. I haven't messed around with those much. But importantly, that only applies to stuff that's really close and flat to the surface, because a normal map does not affect things that stick out far. A displacement map does, because it can actually displace your surface, but for a normal map, which is what you're going to be using for a real-time model, it can't pull and push something out. It can only affect sort of how light bounces off it. So it can fake small details that are close and flat to the surface, but it can't like give you a change to your silhouette. Meaning if you sculpted like a fluffy mane of hair right into your character model, you're gonna have to retopologize every single chunk of fluff you made individually, because that's the only way it's gonna show up on your final model. Like even if you just retopologized right over it and baked it, you would just end up with a terrible looking normal map and it would be really obvious that it doesn't look right. So you'll have to go in and manually retopologize everything, and I've done that before, and it was a really bad time. If you want to see that, watch my Plushmallow retopology video. It was a pain and it took ages. Don't do that. Pro tip from Rose. If you do have little bits and details that you want to stick out, like, again, fur or maybe scales or even hair, try and maybe model them as separate meshes. Don't merge them to the rest of the sculpt, because that way you can ignore them while retopologizing sort of the main body, and then retopologize them separately, or maybe depending on how you made them, they might actually already have good topology. Like, for example, if you used curves or skin modifier or just manually modeled them, then that'll save you a huge amount of time with retopology. I personally currently don't have a lot of models where I made stuff like fur as separate objects. I mostly do that with hair. But if you're looking for some inspiration, hop onto Twitter and check out Milo Goat or Scout Arts. They both make VR chat models, and their models also have sort of fluff bits or hair as separate chunks, and they look really good. I'll leave links in the description below to their Twitter accounts. Definitely check them out if you're looking for some inspiration for 3D models. Another thing you can do during the sculpt that'll make your retopology a bit easier is keeping the area around the joints clean, or even other things that deform a lot, like the face, that aren't necessarily joints. There are parts of the model that don't deform much, like say the chest or the back of the head or like the front of the thighs or something like that, where you can get away with having some slightly weird topology because things aren't supposed to bend and stretch a whole lot, so you aren't gonna notice things messing up too much. So there you can go adding like extra details and stuff to your sculpt without running into too much trouble. But there are areas like the knees or the elbows or the finger joints or around the face where you want some relatively specific topology so that everything can sort of bend and deform in a nice way. So if you have things you'll need to work around in terms of detail in those places, that can really cause a bit of difficulty and make your life harder. There are bits of detail that can work relatively well around joints if they are sculpted well, and that would be things like folds and wrinkles, because generally in real life folds and wrinkles form based on stuff kind of stretching and squashing anyway, so they'll naturally sort of have the right kind of direction for the topology you'll want to add to that area. But other than that, things that are sort of completely separate from deformation and are just extra details can mess you up quite a bit. And I've spent a whole bunch of time talking about just sculpting in preparation for retopology, but I've not really talked much about retopology itself. And that's kind of mostly because this is just a general talky video. I'm not explaining the process that's happening on screen that much. And also because I've explained that in other videos in the past. So check out some of my other videos on retopology if you want a bit more of like a detailed explanation of my process. Either way, I've been talking a lot about sort of having your topology flow in a way that works well with how you want it to move and deform, but I've not really gone in depth much on what that exactly means. So that's sort of what I'm gonna do now. Again, like I said at the beginning, take all of this with a grain of salt. I am by no means an expert on excellent topology. So, in general, when your 3D model is deforming, that means something is stretching and or something is being squished. So think of an elbow bending, that means the inside of the elbow is being squished and the outside of the elbow is being stretched. Or if on the face, if your character is smiling, the cheeks get squished up and the mouth gets stretched out to the sides. So good topology will be essentially topology that's built to support that stretching and squishing and naturally stretches and squishes in the correct directions. If your edge loops aren't properly aligned with the direction in which things are stretching, then you can easily get like very sharp angles between different polygons, and that can cause things like shading issues, or that just literally doesn't deform nicely when a character is rigged. And sort of like I mentioned earlier, when you have a character that's sculpted well, very often that means that the sort of lines and shapes within the character match up with the sort of how the topology is going to need to be anyway, because that's sort of how your muscles and skin and whatever just is shaped and is formed anyway. Like, for example, your muscles, when you move, are sort of contracting and squishing themselves and stretching themselves out, and so the contours of around or about where your muscles are going to be would match up with how your topology needs to be for the respective thing to deform properly. Obviously, with a stylized model like this, I don't have super detailed muscle anatomy, so that doesn't matter, but still around places like the chest, you can see like very rough sort of indications of where the pectoral muscles are, and that sort of shape in the underlying sculpt matches up with how I put the topology there, or rather I put the topology on top of the shape of the sculpt, and that should in theory also deform relatively well because that matches up with how the arms are supposed to deform later. Or another relatively obvious thing would be here with the sort of creases in the insides of the fingers. If you look at your own fingers where you have those creases, that's sort of naturally where things are squashing, and so that's the same direction and same sort of placement where you want your edge loops to be, so that it can really support that kind of squashing motion that you need for your hands to be able to grip stuff and like make fists. That doesn't 100% work for every aspect of a character's topology, because obviously your own skin and muscles aren't relying on being made up of a ton of small polygons, but still thinking of topology and how surfaces deform from the perspective of how things work in real life can give you a good starting point, or help you to really understand why certain things are shaped the way they are. That being said, that can all be very theoretical and hard to visualize, especially around things like the face, where you just have so many things moving in so many different directions. So especially if you're just starting out and figuring out how all of this is working, I'd highly recommend going online and looking at how the pros do it. One thing that has been really helpful for me, for example, especially when I was starting out, is just going onto Google Images and looking up pictures of face topology, and just keeping them open as references to get a basic idea of like the important edge loops I need around stuff like the face. Another really useful thing that I've done more recently is going onto places like Sketchfab and ArtStation and just looking at the wireframes of some of the models posted there, especially the ones made by professionals for like actual games and stuff, because they give you a really good idea of what really the people who know what they're doing are actually doing in terms of topology and resolution, and that might actually be quite different from what you expect. There's also a couple of pretty good videos on YouTube explaining the retopology process. There's some by Flip Normals where they go through sort of the basics and sort of the important things to keep in mind with the topology itself. And also, when you are looking at videos on YouTube, I definitely recommend not limiting it to just Blender stuff, but looking at things made with other software too, because while the tools might be slightly different, the overall workflow and the overall topology you want to get out is going to be relatively similar, independent of what software you're using. On a very similar note, chances are you aren't going to find like an image or a video or a model that has the exact character and the exact sort of style of model that you want to make, but still looking at things, even though they might not be exactly the same thing, can give you a good general idea of just how topology should look basically or in general, that you can then apply to the thing you have. That can be a bit difficult with face topology, especially because a lot of the references are for human characters, and if you're making something like a furry character, like for me this Husky here, you can't really carry them over one-to-one. There's a lot of stuff you can do that's pretty much following the exact same topology, but very occasionally, especially around like how the snout and eyes and mouth kind of connect together, You might not be able to get the exact same loops in place that you would have with a human, but just looking at different references and trying stuff out and just learning over time, you'll slowly get like a feel for how things are supposed to work and things are supposed to look. And that's kind of the process I'm in. Personally, right now, I think I've gotten more or less the hang of it, but it takes a while. It just takes practice and gathering experience. Anyway, this seems like a great time for some shameless self-promotion. In case you didn't know already, I have a Discord server. It's linked in the description below and sometimes also in the pinned comment. So feel free to join that to just share some of your art or hang out and chat or anything like that. Or if you're maybe stuck on Retopology and are not sure whether it's gonna work the way you've done it or whether something needs to be changed, there are also channels to ask for advice or get critiques on a model, and there are people there who can help you out. I might be able to help you out or some of the other people on the server, but definitely give it a look-see. And with that short little aside over, we're done with the retopology and it's time to start working on the rig. And as I said in the beginning of the video, I'm very much not an expert on rigging. It's not something I do a whole lot, and I especially don't get very technical, like I don't generally make super advanced rigs. For models like this, especially stuff that's commissions, I generally stay to the most basic bare bones, just a simple FK rig. With no fancy stuff, no like face rig or even rigify or anything like that. So as is, it can just be used to pose the character and maybe do some very, very light animation, something like hand wave or something like that. It can also be used as a VR chat model like this, though of course, again, it doesn't have any face rigging, so whoever's using it would have to add biseams later. That all being said, it's not like I'm incapable of doing more advanced rigs. I have in the past, for example, for the mermaid character I made, I ended up using a rigify to make a sort of custom rigify rig for her. And for some other characters in the past, I've made a few rigs, like fully custom rigs with some IK stuff and using a couple of constraints here and there. And I've even used drivers for stuff, believe it or not. Like, I can do the math for a driver, I just don't enjoy it. And as I said, I don't really enjoy the process of rigging that much. It's very technical, it's not really my cup of tea. I like very artistic stuff. And currently I'm also not that confident in my ability to rig and do like a technical, more advanced rig with stuff like facial rigging and all the proper corrective bones and constraints and stuff. So I haven't been doing that for my commission models, and those are the ones I've been uploading a lot recently. However, I do want to get better at rigging, so I have gotten myself the rigging course by Pierrick from P2 Design. I probably said that a bit wrong, but I'm not very French, so I'm sorry. But the course looks very good, and who knows, maybe I'll come out of it really enjoying rigging and being like an epic rigger, and there'll be like a bunch of videos of me making really advanced fancy rigs on this channel. Relatively unlikely, but who knows? Either way, even if it's probably not something that's gonna be like my favorite part of the 3D process at any point soon, it is something I want to be able to do for the sake of making my own characters and just bringing them to life fully, but also just for the sake of completion to sort of understand the whole process of making a character a bit more. Like I mentioned earlier during the retopology part of this video, a lot of retopology is preparing your model to be able to be deformed nicely by a rig. And like this, with a very simple rig, even if I had perfect topology, it just wouldn't deform 100% nicely, just because the rig itself isn't advanced enough like to support all that. So being able to make a pretty good rig would also allow me to get a better feel for what I need to be able to do in terms of topology and stuff like that. Plus, I want to be able to animate my characters occasionally, so having access to good rigs is also kind of important for that. Anyway, while I will stick with the fact that I don't particularly enjoy rigging, what I do enjoy a lot is posing the character into very stupid poses while trying out the rig. And so on that great note, that's the end of the rigging part, and here's the finished stuff I've made. There's not really a whole lot to say to this part of the process, like to the end result of it. It's just kind of the final topology of the character and posed into, like, not much of an interesting pose, just a sort of chill pose. What I will say though is I've been messing around with different ways to render the wireframe well. One thing I've used a lot in the past is using freestyle lines and marking all the lines on the character as freestyle edges and then just rendering it like that. But that always takes ages to render because for some reason freestyle lines take ages to render. So this time I added a wireframe modifier to the character and added an extra material that was just pure black and used that to render the wireframes. And they don't look like 100% perfect, but they also rendered in like 2 minutes or something like that. So probably worth it, I'd say. Anyway, that's been all for this part of the video. Tune in next week for the baking and materials. I don't really know what I'm going to talk about there. That's probably going to be a really short video. But anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed this one. Do all the YouTube stuff. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that. And check out some of my other videos somewhere on screen right about now. Or maybe take a look in the description, check out the Discord, check out some of my other social media. And have a good rest of your day. And actually have a good entire week since like it's gonna be a week till my next video. Bye!